When I started recording, it took me out of presentation mode. There we go. Okay. So this presentation is on incorporating climate vulnerability assessment into the identification of critical threats. We cover the rating of critical threats in a separate presentation. So in terms of the open standards, we are in that step one, the part that says identify critical threats, and we're incorporating climate vulnerability assessment in there. So we've got two presentations that are pretty closely linked, but it's too much material to put into one presentation. So we cover as part one using what we're currently calling climate conceptual models to identify climate threats along with your conventional threats. And you can do that at the project level, having a conceptual model that's, for your whole project, a climate conceptual model. And I'll show you some examples of those and how you incorporate the key elements of your climate conceptual into your overall project conceptual model. Or if you're working with a team that's more detail oriented, you could do that target by target, target specific climate conceptual models. And I'll also show an example of that, but probably a little bit more briefly. So I think there are a few of you who have not been on any of our previous calls. So I'm going to give a quick summary of our Climate Smart Open Standards overview. And my apologies to those of you who have been on, because this may be, possibly the second or third time that you've heard this little overview. I'll try to go through that relatively quickly. Then I'm going to cover some key definitions and concepts, and then talk about using climate conceptual models to identify climate threats. And as I said, at the project level, developing project level conceptual models or target specific models, and then finally close with some advice about incorporating different climate scenarios into your conceptual models. Okay, so just to jump into that overview, as I think you all know, John Morrison and I and a few other folks have been working on developing an application developing guidance to make the open standards climate smart. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and go over relatively briefly our suggested changes. So we know that there are thousands of conservation practitioners around the world that are using the open standards to plan and implement their conservation projects. And typically in the past, what we have done with climate change is we've included climate change as a direct threat to our conservation targets. And inevitably it gets a very high rating, and that's just not sufficient. So, so we need an approach that is more detailed. So technically the direct threat of climate change is excess greenhouse gas emissions. Some changes are occurring gradually. We will not see the most serious impacts for decades. In many cases, the impacts are, there are multiple potential impacts, and they're often difficult to predict. We know that as conservation coaches, we face resistance to good conservation planning, and that there's a lot of planning fatigue out there, particularly people who have done a lot of planning, and particularly people who've done a lot of bad planning. We have a hard time getting them to invest in good, detail-oriented, systematic planning. We know staff time and resources are squeezed, that when we're working with a team, we are often lucky to get a solid week of planning for a multi-million-dollar project. And there are folks out there who think that the open standards are already complicated. So we're under a lot of pressure to make climate smart improvements to the open standards as practical as possible, with options where appropriate, that you could do this or you could do that. So a few of us have been working on developing those practical applications. So John and I, as well as my colleague Judy Boshoven and Sean Martin at WWF. We presented some initial ideas at the CCNet Coaches Rally in 2015. Then we had a workshop with a mixture. You know, there were a few open standards folks in there, but it was mostly non-open standards folks. It was mostly people who are specialists in climate adaptation. That was in 2017. And then just recently, just a month or month and a half ago or so, we presented our ideas at the CCNet Coaches Rally in Australia. We are building off of guidance that several organizations have developed, that TNC and FOS and WWF have developed over the last several years. We've also taken into account other climate change guidance, particularly this guide to climate smart conservation that National Wildlife Federation has developed. Is a very useful guide. But there's other stuff out there from the Nature Conservancy, you know, from defenders and various different agencies. And so we've looked at a bunch of those guides. As I said, this Climate Smart Conservation Guide is by National Wildlife Federation is particularly useful, and we have looked very closely at that. The way that they define climate smart conservation is the intentional and deliberate consideration of climate change in natural resource management, realized through adopting forward-looking goals and explicitly linking strategies to key climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And there's some overarching themes in that guide that we need to act with intentionality. We need to manage for change, not just persistence. This is a really important one because as conservationists, we're often accustomed to looking at the past as a guide to where we want to go. We want to get our fish populations back to what they were before they were so heavily overfished, for example. But under climate change scenarios, we need to be thinking about taking into consideration the fact that the future is probably not going to be like the past, and managing for change, not just persistence, which also means that we need to reconsider our goals and not just our strategies. And in some cases, goals that we had previously may not be realistic. And we need to integrate our adaptation work into existing work. So along those lines, our philosophy is that, so a lot of people consider climate adaptation as sort of an add-on. Like on the one hand, you're doing conservation work, and then you've also got some funding to do climate adaptation. And oftentimes it's funding that's just specific for that. And so it's treated sort of separately. But we believe that because climate change is a major threat to our ecosystems and species, and most of the places where we're working, that we need to be taking an integrated approach. And that's why we're using the term climate smart conservation instead of the term climate adaptation. So climate smart conservation should be taking that integrated approach, doing conservation in a way that considers climate change. So we need to understand the effects that climate change has on people, the effects on key species and ecosystems, and the effects that people's reactions can have on those ecosystems. Due to the uncertainty around climate model outputs, we need to use a range of climate change scenarios to bound our uncertainty. So we need to really look at the uncertainty and look at where things could, an area could get drier or it could get wetter, for example. So if you think about the open standards as, this basic series of steps where you summarize what you want to conserve, you understand what the current and desired state of your ecosystems is, that's your viability assessment, you identify and rank your threats, You develop a general model of your socioeconomic and ecological system. So you develop a conceptual model. You identify your strategies based on the general model. You develop a detailed logic chains or results chains to show how your strategies are going to work. You implement your strategies and you check as you go. So that's, the basic open standards as we all know it. So we took a look at this and looked at what we need to change to make those steps climate smart. So, some of the steps are the same. You still define your scope, your conservation targets. You know what, actually, I'm not going to go through it on this slide because this slide is like really super messy. I just wanted to show you that we, took the basic steps and marked them up basically to look at what we need to change. Now, going to a clean slide, some of these steps are the same. You define your scope and your conservation targets and ecosystem services and human well-being. You understand the current state of your ecosystems. You identify your conventional threats and add them to your conceptual model. So that's all sort of your typical open standards stuff. I've color-coded on these slides where we're doing something new or we're doing something different. So after adding your conventional threats to the conceptual model, you want to do climate scenario planning. And John gave a webinar on that last week, and we've recorded it, so that's available to everybody. Then you combine your conventional threats and your climate impacts in conceptual models for your scenarios. So that step is really what we're going to be looking at today. That's a new step. Then you rate your threats and the climate impacts using a slightly different rating system. So we've changed the criteria a little bit. Then you revisit your ecosystems and species, understanding achievable states. So this is the goals step, and instead of having the goals step up under vulnerability up above, we have it after you've done your scenario planning. Then you identify your strategies that need to be climate smart and not maladaptive based on the general model. Then you develop your results chains to show how the strategies will work even in the face of climate change. And it's helpful to include the climate stressors on your results chains because that is your assumption. This will work even in the face of climate change. And then you implement your strategies, monitoring the strategies in climate and adjust. So let me stop very briefly there. I know that was pretty quick, but are there any questions before I go on into what's supposed to be the focus of today's presentation?
I have a question, Tobias.
Yes. Go ahead, Tobias.
So you do away with the desired state of the ecosystems, correct? And my question is that, I mean, even in the face of climate change, we might have what we want to achieve with conservation. That's in any case, that's kind of a matter of societal choice. Yes, it's something that people agree on, and I mean, I understand some goals will not be achievable, but can we really do without that? Shouldn't we still have, or why do you think this consideration, what we would like to achieve in general, becomes obsolete only because we may not be able to reach this because of climate change?
So you still have your goals. We just have moved the goal step down so that you do it after you have looked at your climate scenario planning and done your climate conceptual models and your threat rating. It's just so that you make sure that your goals are informed by all of that analysis. And we're calling them achievable states because we think that it is important to be realistic, not to say, well, this butterfly, according to scientists, does not have, there's not a lot of hope for keeping it here, but our goal is that we're going to quadruple the population of this butterfly. that we need to be a little more realistic about what we can achieve. So you still have the step, it's just later. And we've just changed what we're calling it a little bit. Any other comments or questions? If not, I should probably jump into today's presentation. So I'll just mention, we really welcome feedback on this, and especially as people start using the tools that we're teaching. So please do get in touch with us. Okay, so let's jump into some key definitions and concepts. So what is a climate conceptual model? So we know that in a regular conceptual model, we have conservation targets, direct threats, we have contributing factors, and we've got stresses. In a climate conceptual model, we are using and Marathi allows you to do this now, there are some biophysical factors that you can turn on in Marathi, and they allow you to make stresses that are linkable. The way that stresses have been included in Marathi in the past, there are these little bubbles that you can move around, but you can't link them. So we make a lot of use of the brown biophysical box. So in climate conceptual models, we want to understand the potential impacts of climate change by identifying climate threats and interactions with conventional direct threats. And the way that we do that is by looking at what the potential impacts are of climate change and mapping them out, initially using these brown boxes and then turning some of those climate stresses, what are essentially climate stresses, into pink direct threat boxes and treating them as direct threats and rating them as direct threats and looking at the interaction between those and conventional direct threats. So let me show you some examples. So technically these are stresses, but we're going to treat them as threats. So direct threats, the definition of direct threats are human-induced actions or events that directly degrade one or more conservation targets. They're usually human activities, but they can be natural phenomena to which targets are more vulnerable due to human activities. Like, if you are managing for critically endangered shorebirds, they could be threatened by a tsunami, and so that can be included as a direct threat. We're adding a little bit to that definition and saying, in the case of climate change, natural phenomena that are more extreme due to greenhouse gas emissions, so increasing temperature affecting rare montane plant communities, or more frequent and intense storms. So we're broadening the definition of direct threats. So just as a reminder, the difference between direct threats and stresses, so again, direct threats are the action taken by humans to degrade the conservation or resource management target. Stress is an altered key ecological attribute representing the biophysical impact of that action on the target. And so, typically you have your conventional direct threat, unsustainable fishing, then you have your stress, like change in population structure, as it affects the fisheries resource. So we need to look a lot at the stresses when we're looking at climate change. So typically, as I mentioned earlier, historically we have had climate change in a pink box and considered it a direct threat. And some examples of stresses that it causes are increase in temperature that can cause coral bleaching affecting coral reefs, or decreased snowpack that's affecting rivers and streams, or increase in large severe fires that's affecting our forests. But including it as a direct threat and rating it as a direct threat is not very useful, because it ends up getting a high rating, and that just doesn't really help us very much. So what we're doing is we're moving some of those stresses over into the direct threat category. And for example, with this chain, with the coral reefs that are affected by coral bleaching, the increase in water temperature could be treated as a direct threat. For the rivers and streams that are affected by decreased snowpack that's reducing flow and changing the timing of flow, we can treat the decreased snowpack as a direct threat. And for forests that are facing an increase in large severe fires, we could treat drought, which is a climate stress, as well as fire suppression, which is a sort of more traditional direct threat. We could treat both of those as direct threats. So let me keep going and show you some more examples of this and just explain our thinking a little bit more. So why do we identify stresses? It's essential for climate vulnerability assessment. Greenhouse gas emissions cause a lot of stresses. And so what we're proposing is to treat some of them as direct threats. Detailing out the stresses provides greater ecological understanding of how climate change may impact the conservation target. It explicitly incorporates science in the planning process and provides a better understanding for management, restoration, and recovery. A few folks, including my colleague Judy Boshoven, started a few years ago to develop a taxonomy of stresses, sort of a parallel of the taxonomy of actions and the taxonomy of threats that we have. And it's out there. It's still sort of a draft product, but I just wanted to mention it because I think it could be useful to folks, and I can make that available to people. So now in the next few slides, I want to introduce you a little bit to some climate adaptation language and concepts. So among climate experts, vulnerability refers to the degree to which an ecological system, habitat, or individual species is likely to experience harm as a result of changes in climate. So it's a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So the potential impact, so vulnerability is considered, as I say, a function of exposure and sensitivity that together are considered to be the potential impact of climate change on an ecosystem or species. And then adaptive capacity is added in there as something that could, potentially reduce the potential impact of climate change. And in order to understand these terms, I'm going to start with a non-climate, non-ecosystem example. So if you think about someone who is fair-skinned, who's gotten sunburned, so exposure is the fact that the sun is really strong, and sensitivity is the fact, and I'm going to go into more detail on each of these terms, but just as an initial introduction, sensitivity is the fact that this person has very fair skin. So this is sort of like me, whereas my children are half Latin American, they have darker skin, they go out in the sun, they look nice and bronzed. I tend to look, more like this poor person. So adaptive capacity has to do with, in this example, the ability of the person to, move into the shade or put on some sunblock or, take some sort of action that decreases their exposure to climate change or decreases their sensitivity to it. So let's go a little bit more into these definitions. So exposure is a measure of how much of a change in climate and associated effects a system or species is likely to experience. So it includes things like changes in temperature and precipitation, changes in the frequency and intensity of weather disturbance events, like, extreme storms, droughts. So as we have increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, the direct effects of that, which very often, if you're thinking of this graphically in the form of a of a conceptual model, the things that you have just to the right of increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases are increase in temperature and some sort of changes in precipitation regime. So those are very common exposure factors. Sensitivity is a measure of whether and how a system or species is responsive to changes in climate. So we know that ecosystems and species can be dependent on a particular temperature or moisture regime. They can be dependent on a particular disturbance regime, such as, forests that are dependent on a fire cycle, or riparian areas that are dependent on some flooding events. There can be sensitivity to changes in CO2 concentrations in some plants, and there can be dependence on timing of abiotic phenological events like snow melt, peak spring flows, etc. So roughly speaking, in a conceptual model, your exposure factors are those immediate effects of higher greenhouse gas emissions, while the sensitivity factors are often stresses or altered key ecological attributes. So, with this example, you've got, greenhouse gas emissions causing an increase in temperature and change in precipitation regime, specifically a longer dry season, which then decreases the soil moisture, so there's greater susceptibility to forest fires, which then contributes to an altered fire regime, so larger, more intense fires, which affects the forest ecosystem and its ability to produce forest products and support forest-based livelihoods. So the exposure factors are the increase in temperature, change in precipitation regime. Sensitivity would be more the altered fire regime. So I bolded the roughly speaking because in something that is an exposure factor in one chain can sometimes be a sensitivity factor in another chain. So it's important not to get too hung up on this. I think it's important for us as conservationists to understand how the climate adaptation world has been, some key terms in the climate adaptation world and roughly what their equivalents are in our open standards terminology and concepts. So adaptive capacity is a measure of the ability of a system or species to adjust to climate change impacts with minimal disruption. And many of the factors that have to do with viability, contribute to adaptive capacity. So, is there dispersive capacity of the habitat? Is there connectivity so that it can move? Is there an absence of barriers? Is there redundancy and response diversity within functional groups? Is there genetic diversity? And is there, the potential to recover after disturbance? Again, having to do with viability, distance to other habitats of the same type, having to do with connectivity and habitat patch size. We will talk more about, sorry, I didn't realize that was, okay. We'll talk more about adaptive capacity when we discuss climate smart strategies. So during strategy brainstorming and selection, we'll consider strategies that address conventional threats that inhibit adaptive capacity. Like for example, if you have residential development that fragments and inhibits the altitudinal or latitudinal movement of rare plant communities as climate warms, strategies that maintain or enhance viability will maintain or increase adaptive capacity, and increasing adaptive capacity can decrease sensitivity. So, you know, these terms are not entirely exclusive of one another when you apply them to ecosystems and species. So it's important not to get hung up on the terminology. I just felt that it was important to introduce those of you who haven't seen this terminology before to this terminology. So how are we defining climate vulnerability? We are basically saying that assuming that you have good information, and that's, you know, really critical, you can use a couple of tools, the climate conceptual model and your threat rating, to basically diagram out and then rate your climate vulnerability. Two tools to portray your climate vulnerability. So your climate conceptual model graphically portrays how you believe that climate may affect your conservation targets through a whole bunch of stresses, and it portrays interactions between the climate stresses and the conventional threats. So let me keep going actually and get through the climate conceptual models, and then I'll stop for questions and comments, maybe after this first section. So as I said, you can do project level or target specific models. So the quicker approach is the project level conceptual models. And so from the left to the, sorry, this should say right to left, I think. So you identify your conservation targets, and then you identify your conventional threats and the stresses that they cause, so the right side of your normal conceptual model. Then you add your climate stresses to the conceptual model and identify which climate stresses to treat as direct threats through threat rating. So let me show you an example of that. So this is from a project in the Bahamas. They're working on conserving and restoring coral reefs. And so the ecosystems they're working on conserving and restoring are the coral reefs, especially reef-building corals, and seagrass beds and mangrove habitats. They're also interested in a bunch of fish species like parrotfish, groupers and snappers, spiny lobster and conch, sharks and sea turtles are important. And the long-spined sea urchin is important in this area because it eats the algae off of the corals, so it helps to keep the corals healthy. So they identified a bunch of ecosystem services. I won't go into all of those, and some human well-being targets. I'm now going to move to another slide that has those hidden, but just know that they are there. They did define them. But just so you guys can see the left side of the conceptual model. So in looking at their direct threats and how those direct threats are affecting their conservation targets, they included the stresses. So the corals, the seagrass beds, and the mangrove habitats are affected by a bunch of stresses. So decrease in live coral, loss of seagrass beds, loss and fragmentation of mangrove cover, and loss of connectivity between those ecosystems, between the corals, the seagrasses, and the mangroves. And some of the direct threats that are contributing to that include disease, as well as boat groundings and anchor damage, as well as several other more highly rated direct threats. So unsustainable coastal development causes sedimentation that then contributes to decreasing live coral and loss of seagrass beds, et cetera. Legal but unsustainable fishing practices. So traditionally, people have fished more the groupers and the coral, and the groupers and what were the other ones? Groupers and the snappers, yes. But as there is less grouper and snapper available and less of other desired fish species, people are starting to consume parrotfish. And that's problematic because the parrotfish also eat the algae that grows on the coral. So fishing and selling parrotfish for consumption then causes an increase in macroalgae. And the low diadema, which is the scientific name for the long-spined sea urchin, also causes an increase in macroalgae. So the sea urchin population has been affected by disease. So this is the stuff that's happening in this area without climate change. So lots of stuff happening, you know, a bunch of different direct threats, a bunch of stresses. Now we're going to add in climate change. So with increased atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, we have a bunch of things going on. There's ocean acidification, sea level rise, increase in sea surface temperature, increase in storms. The ocean acidification decreases the structural complexity of the reefs. So, you know, a good healthy reef should have like lots of little nooks and crannies that things like the sea urchins and lobsters can hide in. So when you decrease that structural complexity, you have less habitat for the sea urchins and the lobster. The increase in sea surface temperature is contributing to increased severity and frequency of coral bleaching. And then we've got, you know, sea level rise and increasing storms that are contributing to your decrease in live coral, loss of seagrass beds, et cetera. So even more stuff going on when you add in climate change. So now we're going to treat some of those climate stresses as direct threats. In this case, you know, they aren't always, of course, in a nice little neat group box, but in this case, they happen to be. So this team treated ocean acidification, sea level rise, increase in sea surface temperature, and increase in the frequency and severity of storms, all as direct threats, and rated those alongside the other direct threats that they had. So this is what we're calling the climate conceptual model. I guess you could also call it like more of an ecological model, but it has your climate factors in there and shows how they're interacting with your conventional direct threats and details out how they are affecting, how they are beginning to affect and will in the future much more affect your conservation targets. So now we're going to go to their overall conceptual model. And here you can see that we've included the direct threats. We don't have all those stresses because this is their overall conceptual model, and it would be really hard to fit this on a page and, you know, use it as a communications piece if it had all those stresses. So we had the climate conceptual model separate for all that detail, and then just, you know, added in the climate related direct threats into the overall conceptual model. Maybe I should stop there. Are there any questions at this point? Anybody want to jump in with a question or comment? If not, I will keep going.
Sorry, I have one more.
Yes.
One very brief one from Tobias. Are there any rules to decide which of the climate stresses are turned into threats, or is that up to the decision of the team, or what are the criteria?
That is a very good question, and I do have a slide on that a little bit later. We don't have any firm rules. We just have a few sort of initial guidelines, but I think that's, you know, John and I have sort of a sense at this point, having, you know, developed a bunch of example models and worked with a few teams on this stuff, but no, you know, hard and fast rules. But I will address that a little bit later. Any other questions or comments?
Marge got a question in the chat box. Why the sedimentation shown in brown stress?
Why the sedimentation is shown
Can you go back a slide?
in brown on this one. So this team treated sedimentation as a stress. So unsustainable coastal development, people building large hotels in fragile coastal ecosystem areas causes sedimentation that then flows out into the streams and into the coastal waters and then ends up affecting the live coral and ends up sort of smothering the seagrass beds. And so we treated that as a stress. It isn't a the direct threat is the human action, like people building hotels, and the sedimentation is more of like an altered key ecological attribute.
So Marcia, and that's typically the way we've always treated sedimentation. You always have to give the reason why it's happening, and that's why it's a stress. Part of Femke's question is about whether or not it should be a purple blob, and just whether that's so that's an update of Marathi and the color. So you might explain that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe at the end I should just go into Marathi and show you guys how to turn on those brown boxes and use those because you may not. It's not obvious where to find those in Marathi. So I'll try to remember to do that.
But just
I have a quick question.
The new biophysical factors replace the stresses.
Yep. Or you can use either one at this point. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Greg Main here from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Marathi, we have used it in the development of biodiversity conservation strategies on Great Lakes, but of course we rely on experts like yourselves to do it. Is this a software that's accessible, or do you buy a license, or can you share it, or how does the average person get a hold of Marathi, or are there other comparable softwares that would be able to develop conceptual models? This is more of a process question than anything.
Yeah, so you buy a license. You can get a free trial version and use it out while you're testing it out and deciding if it's useful for you. But it is best to, if you decide to use it, best to buy a license because all of the updates to Marathi are funded by the money that people who buy the licenses, invest in Marathi. So we can only make updates to Marathi if people are buying the license. So the version 4.5 of Marathi just came out, and it has a bunch of really interesting improvements. So yeah, you go to Marathi, MIRADI.org, and buy the software there.
Marcia.
Any other questions?
Yes, Marcia, I just want to know, in your experience, adding the climate change stresses as threats is manageable in the conceptual model, because the approach from 2009 was to build a separate climate change conceptual model. But in this case, I know, of course, that it's better to have it integrated. It's more useful. You see everything in one conceptual model. But just I want to know if it's practical, if it doesn't get too confused in all the examples that you have done, to include them in just one conceptual model.
So with this example, it really is still two conceptual models, because this is in Marathi, this one, the climate conceptual model would be on one page, and this is where you're drilling down into how climate change is going to affect your targets and how it's going to interact with the other direct threats. And then you just take these factors, the climate change factors, and just add them to your overall model, but you don't have all of those stresses in the overall model. So it is still two models. I guess you could try to go straight to this, but what I think you lose by going straight to the overall conceptual model is either you're going to end up with a model that like has a bunch of stresses in it, and so it's going to have a lot of factors in it, particularly if you also have the human well-being factors and you also have the ecosystem services factors. There's just going to be a lot going on in it. So I like this approach of really drilling into the details of climate change on this separate page, and then just, you know, taking those, what you're treating as your climate threats, and dumping them into your overall model.
Okay.
I think it's a pretty manageable way of dealing with it. Any other questions before I go on?
Charles has got another question on the chat. I'll read it to you. Did you look into how to integrate guidance from NatureServe's Climate Change Vulnerability Index to inform vulnerability assessments into Marathi conceptual models?
Sorry, can you read that again? Did we look at which guidance?
Did you look into how to integrate guidance from NatureServe's Climate Change Vulnerability Index to inform vulnerability assessments into Marathi conceptual models?
No, we didn't. We should look at that. Yeah. John, if you can add that to our notes. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
I'm working on it. It's in the notes.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, let me keep going so that I show you guys the target specific models. So this is a more detailed approach, and I think it's helpful for certain teams that are more detail oriented. So a lot of the steps are the same. You know, you start with your conservation target, but then for each conservation target, each of your conservation targets, you identify your stresses and conventional threats on a separate page, and then add the climate stresses to the conceptual model and identify which climate stresses to treat as direct threats. So let me just show you guys an example. I think it's going to be clearer. So this is an approach that a team, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service team has used for a lot of planning in California. So for one conservation target, they reviewed the key ecological attributes, you know, for each one of their conservation targets. And in cases where the key ecological attribute had been altered, then they replaced it with a stress, and then identified the direct threats causing the stresses. This is more sort of going back, for those of you who've been around for a while, it's more sort of going back to TNC's old site conservation planning approach. And you know, then they repeated the process for other conservation targets. So let me show you some examples. So we're in the San Francisco Bay, very beautiful area. And these are the conservation targets. I won't read through these, but you know, a bunch of coastal ecosystems and species. And so we're going to use tidal marsh as the example here. So for tidal marsh, some of the key ecological attributes of tidal marsh are the extent of high quality tidal marsh, and that is affected by the native plant population and the invertebrate density population. And other key ecological attributes are the marsh connectivity and marsh hydrology and water quality. So you can see this is already getting into a lot of detail, and it's just on one conservation target. I should mention that because this is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service project, there were a lot of biologists working on this project, and they're very detail oriented. So they really liked this target by target approach. And I'll go through the rest of this pretty quickly, because it's basically the same steps as before. It's just that you're doing it conservation target by conservation target. So they then looked at you know, what were the stresses? So how those key ecological attributes sort of flip over into being stresses. So, you know, instead of extent of high quality tidal marsh, which is a key ecological attribute, the altered key ecological attribute or stress would be a reduction in high quality marsh. And instead of native plant composition, it would be change in plant composition, you know, more invasive species, non-native species, et cetera. I won't go into all of these. But so they flipped the key ecological attributes over to be stresses, and then looked at the conventional direct threats that were causing those stresses. So why is there a change in marsh hydrology? Well, because of roads and railways and levees. Why is there a change in plant composition and a reduction in invertebrate density and population? Well, because of invasive plants, et cetera. Why is there a reduction in high quality tidal marsh? Because of land conversion. And then, so this is all without climate change. This is just, super detailed with the conventional direct threats. Sorry, I forgot I had blown these up to make them easier to read. So then you add in your climate change. So, and again, the climate stresses are being treated as direct threats so that they can be included in the threat rating. So we've got a change in water temperature regime, precipitation regime, ocean chemistry. All of that is affecting the change in plant composition and reduced invertebrate density. We've got sea level rise that's affecting the high quality tidal marsh. So high quality tidal marsh is both threatened by land conversion as well as sea level rise, basically. And there are other climate threats as well. Now, in their climate conceptual models, they included climate threats twice, basically. So they included them with these different time frames. So one was the near term, which they defined as the present to 2034, and one was the long term from 2035 to 2100. So sea level rise in the near term, sea level rise in the long term. I simplified their example to make it possible to use it as a teaching example, because it was like super detailed and wouldn't have fit on the page if I hadn't done that. But I think it can be useful when you get to the threat rating step to distinguish between the threat rating over the near term and the threat rating over the long term. And we have a little bit more on that in the threat rating presentation. So back to that question of which climate stresses to treat as direct threats. I'm going to go through one example, then talk about our sort of general guidelines on this, and then show a couple of other examples. So coral reefs, greenhouse gas emissions are, increasing atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases, which increases temperature, which causes more frequent and intense storms, which causes erosion and greater siltation affecting the coral reefs. So this is, a chain of stresses. Which one are we going to treat as a direct threat? John and I would treat the more frequent and intense storms in this case. And the general guidelines that we have for this, or sort of our initial ideas about criteria, but this is still very much under development, are, first of all, no double counting. And I should use the example that I have on the next slide to show what we mean by no double counting. Like basically you don't want one factor that's upstream of another factor. Essentially, we think that the exposure factor that's closest to the target, like increased frequency and intensity of storms, is what you would choose. Let me explain that a little bit more in the context of the examples that we have next, because when I say exposure factor, increased temperature is very frequently, at the very beginning of these changes, of these chains. You've got increased atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases, which increase temperature. So I'm not sure I would always choose increased temperature, but I think what we're saying is generally speaking, usually it's factors that are more on the upstream end, more on the left-hand side. One of our rules is do what makes the most sense in your case and don't get stuck, which is the sort of, we haven't really fully developed our guidelines kind of a rule here. Let me show you a few more examples. So this is you've got Western conifer forests that are affected by large and severe fires. So why are those large and severe fires happening? Well, on the one hand, you've got fire suppression, so you have an increased fuel load. On the other hand, you have climate change, so greenhouse gas emissions causing increased temperature and a change in precipitation patterns, decreased annual precipitation in this area, which is causing hotter and drier conditions. So the hotter and drier conditions and the increased fuel load together cause your larger and more severe wildfires, which contributes to poor post-fire regeneration of conifers and, in some cases, loss of forest cover. So, the forest is supposed to have a certain range of fires, of intensity of fires, and we're getting more intense fires, and so that is causing a loss of the forest cover. So in this case, we and here the no double counting rule applies. We would treat the hotter, drier conditions as a direct threat, along with the fire suppression. If you treated larger and more severe wildfires in this case, then you would be double counting, because you'd have the larger and more severe wildfires and the fire suppression. So, one factor that's downstream of another factor. So let me just show another example. And actually, this example is a little bit more the exception to the rule. So tidal wetlands, under climate change, you've got increased temperature, which melts glaciers, which causes sea level rise, which can cause the loss of your tidal wetlands. In this case, we would treat the sea level rise as a direct threat, probably because the melting glaciers are very far away from, these are sort of global factors, whereas the sea level rise is much more localized. And so you wouldn't want to be rating, melting of the polar ice caps, and when you're talking about your tidal wetlands in the San Francisco Bay, for example. You'd want to rate, predictions for sea level rise in your specific area. I think that is it for my examples, but my graphic examples. But here are some examples of climate stresses that we would treat as direct threats, based on our experience to date. And of course, this may change as we get more experience, but changes in precipitation regime, an increase in extreme storms, increased air temperature if it acts directly on the target. So as I mentioned earlier, increased temperature is a very common exposure factor on the very left-hand side of these chains. So you're not always going to want to treat that as a direct threat. But if increased air temperature is acting directly on the montane plants that you're trying to conserve that need a certain lower temperature regime, then you could treat increased air temperature as a direct threat. Increased water temperature, if it acts directly on the target. In marine sites, sea level rise, as I mentioned with that last example, and ocean acidification. In terrestrial and freshwater sites, decreased snowpack and changes in hydrologic regime, like the amount and timing of stream flow. Let me stop there and see if that answers the question of which stresses to treat as direct threats, at least for now, based on the experience that we have. See if anybody has any other questions.
Asked this question, I think it kind of answers it, and it's quite interesting. It kind of states in a more formal way what we've been doing anyway. So yeah, it goes some way to answering it. Yes.
Okay. The real rule, I think, is that you need to draw it out. You need to develop the this version and then look at it and see in your context what makes sense to treat as the direct threat. I think that's our most important role. So when would you develop one conceptual model? When would you develop, more than or rather one climate conceptual model? As I mentioned, even the Bahama corals example has a climate conceptual model and then an overall conceptual model. So it's really two conceptual models. But we think that you should take that approach that the Bahamian corals took, if possible. It's really when you're working with teams that are more detail oriented that you would want to take the target by target approach. And I would say working with a group of biologists in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is one of those settings where it's really helpful. I mean, we all know as conservation coaches, you have to adapt the tools so that they speak to the people that you're working with, so that they like the level of detail that they're seeing. So I think this middle approach, this middle approach, one climate-specific conceptual model, and then incorporating the important climate stresses and threats into your overall project conceptual model is the approach that in most cases I think works. But you can develop the target-specific conceptual models when you're working with really detail-oriented teams. Okay, so last but definitely not least, a little bit of advice on incorporating different climate scenarios into your conceptual models. So for those of you who either were at the rally or were on the webinar last week on climate scenario planning, we know that what we're advising is to do climate scenario planning, and you will end up wanting to take forward at least a couple of different climate scenarios. So you may be working with a project where one of the climate scenarios that they want to consider is extreme heat waves with less precipitation, which they're calling dry roasted. And the other one that they want to consider is extreme heat waves with more precipitation. So they've sort of decided that the gradual warming, they'd rather look at the extreme heat waves. They'd rather focus on the more extreme temperature scenarios. But these are the two that they want to take forward. So how do you incorporate that into your conceptual models when you could have less precipitation or you could have more precipitation? Those are really different scenarios. So how do you incorporate different climate scenarios into conceptual models? So our guidance to date, and I have to say we don't have a lot of experience with this yet. We're hoping to get more soon, and hoping that you all can help us with this. With multiple climate scenarios, you can either develop more than one conceptual model, like with that previous example, you could develop two conceptual models, climate conceptual models, or you could include the impacts in one combined model. Like you could include, what are the most severe impacts from all of your scenarios into the same conceptual models. So that's the approach that the San Francisco Bay folks took. They had conceptual models for each one of their conservation targets, but each of those conceptual models incorporated, their two scenarios were extreme, what was it? It was like hot and dry and cool and wet were their two scenarios. And they decided to incorporate the extreme potential impacts of both the hot and dry and the cool and wet into their conceptual model for the tidal marsh and their conceptual model for the water birds and all of their target specific conceptual models. I do think that it's helpful to consider more than one time horizon for the climate threats in your, and you can do that, as the San Francisco Bay folks did in the same conceptual model, like, sea level rise over the near term, sea level rise over the longer term. So we don't have a lot of advice to give about how to incorporate different climate scenarios into conceptual models. We just, at this point, we don't want to overcomplicate these planning processes. So this idea that, if you have 4 climate scenarios that you have to develop 4 different conceptual models, just sounds like, ugh, people are going to run screaming from that approach. So we want to try to avoid that if we can. So I will stop there. That's it. And just see if you all have more questions or comments.
Marcia, do you have an example of that can show us in the case of when they use, what was the first one that you use the 2 scenarios in one conceptual model? That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, so the San Francisco Bay, I think it's not really explicit, but they had these 2 scenarios, hot and dry and cool and wet. But they looked at the potential impacts of hot and dry and cool and wet on tidal marsh and incorporated that. It's not really explicit. It's hard for me to say, well, change in marsh hydrology was from the hot and dry, or so it's not really obvious how it's incorporated, but they've told me that they did that analysis of looking at how those climate scenarios would affect each one of their targets, and they've looked at literature and then tried to incorporate that into each of their target specific models. I think it's a little bit easier when you're looking at a factor like sea level rise, where you know what the direction is that it's going to go in. You just don't know how extreme the change is going to be. It's a little bit harder when you're talking about things that could go in opposite directions, like the hot and dry and the cool and wet. Those are very different scenarios, but supposedly they did incorporate that into these conceptual models.
And that's the only example. Nobody else has tried.
That's the only example that I know of at this point. We don't have a lot of experience applying this stuff yet. So I'm hoping to start working on another Fish and Wildlife Service project soon and get more experience.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Other questions? Does this seem like a practical approach, something that you can do, something that's not overwhelmingly complex? And are any of you planning on trying it? Oh, I should jump over to Marathi and show you how to turn on those brown factors. Let me do that. And if anybody wants to answer my question, feel free to jump in. Oh, it's opening on my other screen. Hold on, give me a second and I will bring it over to the screen.
I think the power of this approach and the utility of Marathi is that it's systematic. Climate change is so complex and overwhelming to many biologists that in this manner you can parse it out, and by dissecting it, it seems to be a little more manageable. So in that sense, it is very useful and very helpful. As I say, we've used it on the Great Lakes before, but we treated climate change slightly different, and So I think there's great practicality. I got a lot out of your presentation.
Great, thank you guys. So this is a new version of Marathi 4.5 that just came out. And if you go under your preferences, you guys can see that there's some slightly different colors and fun things in Marathi these days. But anyway, to turn on those brown factors, you go to, where is it? Project settings? Yes, project settings. Under the preferences, under project settings, the factor mode, the default, oh good, the default these days includes biophysical factors and results. Excellent, that's great. I've been asking for that change for a while. It used to be that the default was contributing factors and intermediate results only. So, so now the default, if you're using an older version of Marathi, you can turn on the biophysical factors and results. But it seems that's the default now, so that's good. So it's the same as you know, human well-being targets when they were first introduced. You had to turn them on, but now that's the default that they're there as well. So, any other questions or comments? Well, okay. Well.
No, thanks. Yeah, very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating, and please let us know your experience in using this stuff. And if you have comments for us, if you have questions, if we can help you in any way, then stay in touch.
Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye.